Because when you are unsure of how to use these websites, it creates a problem. And I think the biggest problem that Ancestry is having today is that people will make an account, they will start a tree, and they create a profile. And what ends up happening is then they will get these hints. The hints will bring them to other people with the same name, and they're not properly triangulating these sources. So, and I think that's where the lack of education comes from. And it's so important that we try to bridge that gap for many reasons, mostly because people who aren't aware of how to triangulate these sources, they end up it becomes this identity culture, and it starts to erase the true oppression and cultural erasure that has happened over time and century due to lack of information, lack of education, and lack of the ability to get to these documents.
Cross the Atlantic with nothing but names, Irish and Scottish blood in our veins.
Tracing migrations, I feel like the migration patterns between Ireland and Britain and into the Atlantic Canada is something that is very fragmented in our teaching, as well as what's available for documentation as well.
Work the minds and the bones in the land, built this life with calloused hands. That's how we got here. Salt, water, and stone. That's how we got here. Carrying it home. That's how we got here. Gathering
So today's guest, I am Zita White. Now, I met Zita through a genealogy Facebook group where I was just asking some information, trying to gauge people's where they got their interest in genealogy and sort of if they're having any hurdles right now. And Zita was great, very I'm very grateful to one of the hundreds of people that I got to reply over the few different groups I asked this question to, and her answer resonated with me for several reasons. Partially, the area she's from, I'm very familiar with in Nova Scotia, and she just sounded like she'd be an interesting person to talk to and have an interesting perspective on her family history. So I'm going to sort of re-ask that question. So, Zita, what is it that got you interested in genealogy in the first place?
First, I'd like to say thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and be able to discuss this with you today. I think that what piqued my interest when it came to genealogy, there's many things, but some of the main things were the inherited fragments that were in my family tree to begin with, and it honestly led to many emotions. And I kind of dabbled throughout the years and had a great interest in some of the architectural things around my city. And when I started to dive into that, I started to discover different layers of history. And throughout my high school education, none of it really made sense to me, and it kind of just it gave me a bad taste in my mouth. And then I decided I was going to start looking for the answers myself.
And you know what? That's a great thing, and that's one thing I think that family history does, because so many people have that distaste in their mouth. I always loved history, but they have that distaste because, history often when it's taught is very dry and it doesn't really relate to you too much when you're thinking about all these things to happen. But when you start to look through the lens of your ancestors and start to uh, respect history from that, it makes the history around them much more meaningful, I find.
Absolutely. I found it to be one of those topics that no matter what the interest that I was doing, it always brought me back to history. And a great example of that is I'm a crocheter. I like to crochet. And so when I started to look into, my family of knitting and crocheting and fabric work, it brought me right back to cultural, practices. And so that really gave me another angle as well. So I've had lots of angles to look at this from.
Yeah, it is really, and that's one thing I find that I really get attached to is some of those things that, oh, this is an interest. This is also an interest that somebody in my family. With me, a lot of it revolves around food. It seems, I there's certain things that spark memories in my childhood of certain foods that we eat at certain occasions, that certain relatives, or even just certain foods that I never really understood where my like came from this food. But then I found out that my great grandmother, I mean, say shortbread, she was known throughout her community for her shortbread cookies. In fact, I've been on the Facebook groups from that community in Nova Scotia where she's from, and the people that are old enough to remember her, they say they remember her as kids, and it's kind of funny. They call her Granny Nash, which is Granny Anderson, which is what we always call her, and they always talk about her shortbread. So it's
That's wonderful.
yeah, so it's just and I have a strong love for shortbread, and I never really quite understood where exactly it came from. It was just a general Scotch hit, but even she apparently made baked beans every Saturday, and I love homemade baked beans. It's something I can't get enough of. And I still, and my grandfather used to make them too, and I still tease my wife that she can't make them as good as my grandfather, but they're getting close.
It's so special when those things come up in our life too, and I don't think we recognize it in that way because it's almost subconscious. And that again is another angle that really led me to look down the angles that I did. And when I started this personal curiosity, it turned into a very disciplined research project very, very quickly. And it became a project structured around the structural history, because, like I was mentioning before, the fragments in information, fragments in cultural understanding. It was definitely it definitely led me to becoming the independent genealogical researcher that I am today.
Yeah, and that's um there is so much out there, but it often is very fragmented, and often
Mhm.
it's very fragmented what our own families know about themselves. Um, so when you start digging, you're discovering just not new things to you. You're discovering new things to your parents, your grandparents, even if you have the opportunity to share with them. They didn't realize. So
Absolutely, absolutely. And the other thing too was like, the reconstructing of my family documented line. Um, you know, sources are such a important role in this, and I don't think that enough conversation is had about the important documents such as birth records and parish records, marriage records, probates and wills, articles, Facebook groups, and archives and historical texts as well. Tracing migrations, I feel like the migration patterns between Ireland and Britain and into the Atlantic Canada is something that is very fragmented in our teaching, as well as what's available for documentation as well.
yeah, you're right. And it's there's not often you have well, especially with you coming from my family comes from Ireland, all my dad's side, Scotland, all my mom's. So I'm a Celtic Canadian, is how I refer to myself as. I a lot of it isn't documented well because they came before 1860. They wouldn't come to a new 1867. They wouldn't come to a new country. They were just a British citizen or a citizen of the British Empire that just relocated. So it would be no difference if they would have moved from London to Liverpool. You wouldn't necessarily might not have the documentation of
Mhm.
these people because they're not changing countries. They don't have any borders to go through.
Yes, that is a very important point that you bring up there. Mostly because I have I have encountered this as well, and I will I will touch on some of that a little bit later. Just because it does involve very structural research, and when we come to diving into our roots, I see a lot of people going right for the DNA test, right for the ancestry.ca, and I I have encountered my own pros and cons. And I have my own opinions on that. I will say it is a useful tool, and I use that very broadly. Because when you are unsure of how to use these websites, it creates a problem. And I think the biggest problem that Ancestry is having today is that people will make an account, they will start a tree, and they create a profile. And what ends up happening is then they will get these hints. The hints will bring them to other people with the same name, and they're not properly triangulating these sources. So, and I think that's where the lack of education comes from. And it's so important that we try to bridge that gap for many reasons, mostly because people who aren't aware of how to triangulate these sources, they end up it becomes this identity culture, and it starts to erase the true oppression and cultural erasure that has happened over time and century due to lack of information, lack of education, and lack of the ability to get to these documents.
Oh, exactly. And it's actually kind of funny. I'm just in the process of developing a course for people that that are sort of the hobbyists, don't want to quite be professional level, but really need to get their stuff kicked off. And like the first third of the course is almost about how to do an audit of your tree and get rid of those. I call them sticky leaves from Ancestry.
Mhm.
People don't realize they're hints; they're not facts. And I mean,
Yes.
sometimes you can get really great hints because they actually list the facts, but that's always a red flag for me as soon as I look at when I'm doing for clients. I look at the trees they have a lot of times, and sometimes they're just wanting to need to do work on them and fix them up, and I see that
Where do you start?
from Ancestry Tree, nothing is the actual documents where it came from.
Mhm.
Anyway, but cultural. We often think of that cultural erasure is something non-European based, but within like one of the biggest problems with a lot of Irish people is there were our ancestors that came from Ireland. Irish people weren't highly thought of within, so often they would not when they came to Canada and or the States, they would not admit they're Irish. So families go on thinking they're Scottish or English for generations just because um, when they came over here, they started identifying as instead of O'Reilly, they just started identifying as the last name Riley here because they wanted to have equal opportunity to work. And it's yeah, it makes the record hard. Or I know with a lot of Scottish, there's the Mick and the Max, and people have their opinions that one is Protestant, one's Catholic. It's neither. It's just you do find the MC more in the Ulster Scots, but it's interchangeable throughout, and you'll see this change in records,
Yes.
and people don't realize because that's not my relative. That I'm looking for an MAC, and this is MC. No, they change it. In fact, I have cousins that they all have the same last name. And they're not that much older than me. The most recent one's like 2 years older than me. The other one would be like 30 years older than me, and all in the same family. I think there's 6 of them. I think there's 6 ways they spell their last name between them. So
Yes, no, and you're right. That's a very good point that you make. And I think so there's 2 points that I'd like to make with what you said, or just bring it back to what you said about the Mac and the O. I think this is not something. This brings us back to sort of the gap in Canadian educational system when it comes to they I shouldn't say lack. I should say I use that word gap because Canadian history focuses heavily on settlement and Indigenous relations, Confederation, war history. Rarely does it ever dive into things like Anglo-Norman land law, British peerage structure, and specifically, like we were just stating, like Irish feudal adaptations, medieval legal mechanics. This isn't something that the average Canadian is taught, and therefore, when they don't know the structures, they don't know what they're looking at, and this ends up becoming more about genealogical literacy, and that requires, international archives, cross-border research, medieval terminology knowledge, like I just stated, and um, there needs to be a bridge in that gap, I think, because this is what leads us to the to understand my Nova Scotia roots specifically. I had to study 12th century Europe, and that gap really, really surprised me when it came to how little we talk about in Canada about historical oppression of the Irish, the Welsh as well, and under the British rule, populations and the the confiscation of cultural suppression, famine policy. That history doesn't compete with Indigenous suffering. It actually contextualizes it into the colonial system. And many of the settlers who arrived, like you said, in Atlantic Canada weren't elite power brokers. They were displaced themselves, coming from regions that had already experienced cultural, economic subjections. And when we don't understand that layered history, we end up oversimplifying identity into the oppressor and the oppressed. And without seeing how power actually functions across centuries, this leads to a lot of division, in my opinion. I think historical literacy dissolves this division, and it doesn't erase anyone's suffering. It clarifies the system that produced it.
yeah, I think, like, particularly with my Irish ancestors, well, my Scottish ancestors for the most part, except for my great grandmother who came in 1905. All my Scottish ancestors basically came here because of the clearances. You talk about oppression, literally being burnt out of your house so you can, and being told go find a place to live, and you know, uprooting where your family had lived for centuries because you thought it was, and but never owned the property, to coming to start in a brand new place where you're facing forests and woods, and you know in a way those they're better off because if they'd stayed in Scotland, they never would have had the chance to own land themselves. They never would have had some of these things that are advantages, but
Mhm.
they yeah, they weren't colonizers as much as they were refugees. A lot of the um, early immigration to Atlantic Canada, and it's it's unfortunate that yeah, some of them did become colonizers because they kind of lost that vision. And then I think that's the danger of history is, you always say the people who forget a history are bound to repeat it. Um,
Yes.
and it is so true because you do see these things being repeated, and often it's the people that had been the oppressed that wind up becoming the oppressor because they now have this power or this elite status that they wouldn't have before. But yeah,
Mhm.
it's I studied medieval history, so and purposely I loved history, but I had so much of Canadian history when I went to university. I thought, well, I wanted to study history from something that would be new and enjoyable. I did take a few Canadian history courses, but they were like one of them I loved. They took a Canadian course on the Depression. The only reason I liked it was because there was two guys in their class that at that point seniors could go to university for free, and they had lived through the Depression. And any group work, I always went with them because they always had the greatest stories because they were telling me it from their own memory and from what they experienced as opposed to some dry textbook.
Wow, that's phenomenal. That must have been quite the experience.
It was. I don't think I necessarily got the greatest mark in that class because I didn't always align with the teacher professor, but I think I learned probably more about Canadian history than I did from any of the other Canadian history courses I wound up taking in university. But yeah, you talked about education. You would have loved my grade 9 history teacher. All we did was study the British Empire. He had he had this old, I think it was a book from the 50s or 40s and it was all basically from the Battle of Hastings on, and that's all we studied for that. And I I
I'm
loved it.
speechless. That one threw me for a loop. Wow.
Yeah, and that was in Greenwood, down in the valley. But
Sorry, so you said that was like a university teacher?
no, that was a high school junior high grade 9 teacher.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I've actually found the book online. It's called and it was interesting. I have a copy of a similar entitled book, but the book that I had is about PEI. So I was looking for information on this, and it's called Our Island Story, and it was an old textbook on basically British history. I think it covered up to just about the World War II period, so that's why I thought it was.
That's interesting because that's actually something that I have discussed um, numerous times with other people who have helped me along the research, and I would love to see a copy of that book or be able
Yeah,
to.
yeah,
Yeah, that would be
you can
really
find it online.
interesting.
I think I found it on even Open Library. I think I found it
Yeah,
there, but it was just as soon as I saw it, and I go like, "That's the book I'm using in grade 9." Because I was looking up the subbook, like
yeah.
this one was English. This is the one, and I sort of perused it online. So yeah, that's it. It was
I wonder if it's something that they still use in their teachings because I don't remember ever, like, I went to school around here too, and I don't ever remember seeing that book. And again, that's kind of where I got that bad taste in my mouth. This, and I want to maybe rephrase that into a yearning for knowledge because, as I stated before, every interest I had brought me right back to where I am today. From working with textiles to, loving, rocks and in geography and even down to like mathematics and writing. That's I actually did do one of the ancestry DNA tests. I was curious enough. And like I said, it was definitely a helpful tool because I heard you mention something about how a lot of families were thinking that they were Scottish and they were actually Irish. And it was actually the opposite for me. And when and I was almost disappointed when I got my results. And if I hadn't have dove into like the layers of what those results actually mean, I think I would still be disappointed. And so that DNA misunderstanding is a big one for me. I see a lot of people will say, "Oh, I've got royal blood." Well, royal blood is very common, but royal succession is rare, and that leads me right back again to the gap that we have when it comes to the medieval Europe, and it's simplified for us in Canada down to kings and queens and dates, and we don't really understand the system. And if you're not taught that system, then it kind of becomes this muddle of like, oh, I'm related to, Queen Elizabeth the First. And then when and it led me into a lot of ups and downs, a big roller coaster of emotions because I started my family came I'm going to back up a little bit there and say that my father um my father used to tell me all kinds of stories about where our family came from, and I took it as a grain of salt. I thought he was always boasting, and so I kind of just like, I didn't really think much of it. And then I decided to do the ancestry too. And for about 2 years there, I kind of did my research. I kind of, um, like I said, the ups and the downs, and until I had that literacy and understanding, you know, uh, it kind of led me down, well, I guess I'm no more special than the rest of the royals, right? And so the royal blood. And I think too, understanding that one person can end up having two grandparents on both sides. But like if we just do the math on that,
Oh yeah,
person,
I've
do you
done it.
know what I mean? And like the years that go by between those generations and
Yeah.
understanding what that actually means.
You talked about medieval period, the beginning of the medieval period, with the 1200s. You
Mhm.
would so trace your ancestry back then. Somebody I was born in 1970. They're taking if a generation's 25 years, and it is and it
Gets
isn't.
muddy.
It's funny, but it depends. On a good average, you were to work around to about your 25th great grandparents. You're around 1200, um, and you have 12, 1300 somewhere in there. It could be, if you have long generation gaps, you might be up to the 1100, somewhere in the 1100s. So you're around the time of Braveheart, Edward
Hmm.
Longstreet and William Wallace, and you have
Hmm.
25. Your 25th great grandparents. You have 134 million of them,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
there was only 12 million people on all of the British Isles at that period. So
Yep.
it's, I was able to my sixth great grandmother. I was able to connect to a history that had a legitimate from like been written about and able to connect. And through that and through a few different other histories, I was able to connect back to Edward Longshanks. Well, being a proud Scot, that was really embarrassing. Um, but he's my 24th and my 25th great grandfather. That's only
Hmm.
from two, like one spot that I trace. And I'm sure he's there multiple times. He'd have to be. But just anybody whose ancestry can come from a region that they've been for a sustained period, like
Hmm.
Great Britain, you are related to the royals somehow.
Yes.
It might not
Yes.
be a
And
direct line, but you're in there somehow.
right. And I think that's something we should also talk about enough more too, about the intermarriage web of noble families and how they intermarry consistently. Like this, it creates shared ancestry across thousands today. But again, shared ancestry doesn't equal succession. And understanding the succession law, because it's just barely touched in our Canadian curriculum. So this and I'm not familiar with the United States, so I can't speak on that, but just from my own experience, I was not taught these things, so I had to seek the information myself. It's there, you just it's not the first thing that we all learn about. And so I think the educational gap leads to some very important consequences that we should start to bring light to. For example, people confusing surnames with sovereignty, ego inflation, replacing structural literacy, and the lack of vocabulary creating myth making. People don't understand what the results are meaning, and they don't know how to use them to their benefit. For example, my maiden name is Butler, and I was successfully able to trace my paternal line um, back to the Irish dynasty of Butler of Kilkenny. And I was really trying to avoid at all costs any ego boasting here, because the Butler name is a big name, and it took me so long to understand the breakdown of the surname, where they all came from, and that led me down that sovereignty, indigenous sort of. And when I say indigenous, I mean indigenous of like globally indigenous, right? Where do I come from? That's the question. Where do I come from? And so. Uh, when you look at DNA results from Ancestry, for example, it gives you percentages, and then it gives you migration patterns. And if this is where that literacy comes in, if you're able to look at those results and have that discernment and that literacy, you're able to put together a picture for yourself, which Ancestry.com does not allow you to do fully. It wasn't until I took my results from the one website and started to use other websites like GenomeLink was another one I used. I found that one it to be somewhat beneficial for triangulating. Their map was very beneficial for looking at migration patterns. Um, and I would say that, when you go into these hints, if you again know what you're looking for, I find them to be like clues. And I often joke and say that I'm a detective for the dead because that's kind of what we're doing, detective work here. You have to have more than one source. You have to be able to, the only true sources really are these peerage records, and these marriage records. That's really what we have to go on. And it's a big mess of
And you have to put a certain trust to them. I always tell my clients, I said, I can get your ancestry, we can probably get it that back to a certain point, but am I going to tell you that's 100% truthful? No, unless I could dig up that person and have them right here and say, is this your wife? Is this the person
right.
that's identified in this record as your wife? And that's who had your children? And her likewise, he's the father of all your children?
It's all speculative.
It's all speculative at a certain, you're doing the detective work. We're trying to narrow it down. Yeah, it's I often say that. I'll often joke. What was that movie? I see dead people. I always just say I seek dead people, because really that's, as a genealogist, what you're doing. You're seeking those connections, and
Yes.
you can. And I find it's even beyond what we think is the normal records people have to look at, because there's so much there that isn't referenced. When you start finding these records and you find your ancestor living in a certain place at a certain time, you might not find a lot about them other than the dry, the when they lived, when they died. I like to say, you look at tombstone. This I could differentiate myself as a family historian as opposed to a genealogist in a way. Though I am technically a professional genealogist, but I really call myself a family historian, because a genealogist is, if they look at a tombstone, they see the date that we were born, the date they were after, and then they go on to the next relative. I look at the dash in between. That's where the story is.
Mhm.
And that dash on tombstone takes such a small space, but for most people, that's the majority of their life, is that dash. And you can find so much of that information by knowing where to look, having an understanding of the contextual history which they lived, because you might not find that a document mentioning your relative, but you might find, well, your relative was, a weaver in. This is something that weavers were dealing with at the time. You find articles about that, or you find out, you start digging deeper. That's when you might actually find your relative mentioned, and knowing a little bit about it and a little bit about them, you get to get that information from, sometimes not always their name, but how they wound up being referred to in the community.
Yes, yes. From the contextual point of it, it's there's a lot of clues that I think I have had to go over my notes and thousands of times. The sleepless nights that I have spent, going over these documents, what I could find online, just in Nova Scotia. I'm very limited to what is accessible to me. I have available, the Nova Scotia, what's online, basically. Um, and without spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars accessing, things like Burke's peerages, I've done my best. Um, a fun little side story here, that I'm very grateful for is that, along my journey, I have met some very amazing people. One being, back in 2022, when our country was speaking up for its freedoms in Ottawa, I met a friend online, and we we became very close, and I started talking about my interest in Ancestry, which then led to her deciding to take a little look into it as well. And what turned from, what was a solitary deep dive into my ancestry turned into a very collaborative project full of sleepless nights. And turns out that we are cousins. And we were joking about the whole, fourth cousin, 5 times removed, 11 cousin, 10 times removed jokes, right? The brother sister cousins, all the jokes, and but when it come down to it, this is what led us down to really understanding and documenting it effectively, because it was so annoying to see all of these duplicates. Like, the duplicates were the death of us, I tell you. Um, but it does take a lot of work to verify, not just to build a tree, but to verify the tree. And it wasn't until, you know, some of those challenges were presented to us, that we really understood how much of a gap there was. And, now it's turned into something that challenges us, sharpens us, and it connects us to our lineage in a way that we never would have before. And I've brought some really amazing people from all over the world.
I know I talked to people, you talk about that, the idea of cousins and, cousins marrying cousins, like you said about the inmarrying of the royals. It's awesome what we think about it. But with particularly someplace like Nova Scotia, there's so much endogamy, which was a word I never heard until I started studying ancestry.
Mhm.
In studying genealogy, it's not something I thought of, but our ancestors, like anybody, immigrants today, when immigrant comes to a new country, they come and they usually go to a community where there's other people of that. If they have a choice, they go to where there's other people of that culture. That's why you
Mhm.
have places like Chinatown in San Francisco,
Mhm.
and Little Italy um, in New York, or Little Ireland in outside Boston. There's like you have
Place names are a
like,
big thing.
people
Yes.
people really there because of course you're going to go with the people that have a similar culture. I mean, I have a friend in England. He's been there well, pretty much since he graduated university. He married a woman from England, but he involves himself in a Canada club in London because there's other Canadians, right? You go to
Wow.
the people that you have a shared bit of understanding and point of view of. And that happened to our relatives. Your third great grandfather that might have been shipped over here, his father might have said, "Well, yeah, my brother has a son that lives in Nova Scotia as well," and so you seek out that person if you're able to, or you seek out that community, or at times where whole communities move, and that's where you get what's worse, makes duplication is worse, is the stupid Scottish and Irish have naming patterns where they use the same names over and over and over and over and over. So
Yes, that was oh
you have
man.
5 people that are basically the same age, all the same name.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Mm-hmm.
and no
Well,
wonder people get confused.
yes, and I think that is where everybody starts to, um, and the average person going to try and build a tree is going to get very frustrated with this process. And I say that because, like I mentioned, this turned into a very deep and structural historical project for me. And when I thought I was done, I wasn't. And so, bringing back to the names, I'll just give you an example. Uh, like I said, my maiden name is Butler. And in Nova Scotia, we have a lot of butlers. And I think the premise is, oh, well, yeah, we're related somehow, whatever. But they don't think people really understand how, and how it's not like it's a small world. And I always thought, like, I lived in Ontario growing up until I was about 12 years old. I grew up with most of my family thinking that the butlers came from Ontario. Not the case. Um, turns out that, my great grandfather up into my third great grandfather came here from Newfoundland. Well, where did they come from before that? And then you've got documents that state, for example, the first settlers were in the 1700s. But this document stating that they came over in the 1600s. So then you kind of have to go digging a little bit deeper. And some of that information is not in Canadian text. This is what brings you back to, cross-border information. I had to, outsource information from a couple of cousins that I met, again, via TikTok, in the States. And they started sending me, pictures of certain pieces of text. And throughout that, this turned into a very multi-person project, and we have spent almost 5 years in total at this point documenting the at least from my side, the paternal side of my family. What I did find was that my paternal side and my maternal side did end up coming back together generations later. I think in my 7 generations from me. And at first I was really freaked out. I was like, what do you mean? But then you go and see that someone's got 14 children. Oh, well, there you go.
I mean, like how easy would it be for you to be best friends with one of the other 14 children's descendants and never have a clue, or wind up
And
marrying
that's
you?
just it.
And that's
You just never know.
yeah. When you start getting it back that far, when you do the map out, it's like, okay, it's it's you don't have that ick factor so much when you think oh,
Right.
they married their fourth cousin. Well, yeah, you probably you could have married your fourth cousin and you might not have known it. You might actually be married unless you actually do the and work the history down.
I think back to this book that actually my daughter found this book in a dumpster in a library, and she brought it to me. It's called it says How the Irish Saved Civilization: The Untold Story of Ireland's Heroic Role from the Fall of Rome to the Rise of the Medieval Europe. And I haven't really read it a whole lot, skimmed through it, but that statement, how the Irish saved civilization, really it set something in motion for me. It said something like, okay, well, yes, they intermarried, but what did they actually go through? And brings me back again that, we oversimplified history, and consequently, it ends up creating erasure of some of these cultures. And this is why we don't know. This is why people don't understand, because, uh, it's just now that some people are starting to realize that Newfoundland is the most Irish place outside of Ireland, for example, right? I have spent years growing up in Newfoundland. A lot of my family is from Newfoundland and came to Nova Scotia. Well, I never thought to think, well, where did they come from before that?
Yeah, it's funny. I have the same sort of experience, but in a backward sense, I knew my family was Irish on my dad's side, but there are certain ones where you can't. You go back a certain point, and I'm realizing how many of them came from Newfoundland. They're Irish, but they came from Newfoundland to live outside Halifax in around Prospect Bay and stuff. And it's just I knew my one great grandmother was, but now that I've started searching back, I'm finding other second great grandparents and third great grandparents on different lines. They all the amount that I thought came directly from Ireland to Nova Scotia is I'm overwhelmed how much is from Newfoundland, and understanding Newfoundland. Yeah, there's great record sets because a lot of them came as part of the fishing trade. So there's merchant records that people aren't aware of that you can find, and you can find different things about your relatives that are out there. And there's some really good documented stuff on some of those sites where people wouldn't think to look. You wouldn't.
Right. I
Somebody's
didn't
not gonna go
either,
look up
honestly.
in life and probably go, well, can I find their grocery list? But guess what? They had the list of their supplies and their food because they were getting it shipped from somewhere. So
Yes, you're so right. And I think, because I've listened to a couple of your other podcasts there, and one of them was, I'm forgetting the name, right off the top of my head here, but, he was discussing, interviewing our, relatives and, documenting those stories. And it brought me back to thinking, like, the stories that my grandparents told me of, their time in Newfoundland. They My grandmother would talk about, her parents being lobster fishermen, and how, she used to bring lobster sandwiches to school, and how she used to get made fun of. And so she told me this story as a child, and it kind of just didn't really make much sense to me at the time. And I thought, oh, well, that's so sad. Like, today, now lobster is so expensive. And I would say to her, well, that wouldn't happen today. And she would just sigh. And as a child, I didn't understand how um how heavy that story was, and but how contextualizing it was too. Because when you think about when she was alive, it would have been, she was born in like 1940s. So like, she still is alive, sorry, like when she was born, it kind of puts a placement into, contextualizing your own family's timeline. And I think that's really important for us, especially nowadays, by keeping these cultures alive. Like you were saying in the beginning here, the food, is a big one. Like, I thought for the longest time I was just Scottish, or just with a little bit of touch of Irish in there. Turns out that, I'm actually way more than that. And when I started really diving, I now understand why I have a love for salt, and why, living in Nova Scotia, in certain parts of the geography of Nova Scotia, make me feel sicker than others. Like, these are the other things that people don't look into when they get their results, the traits that can help us understand, who our ancestors were, what traits they passed on to us, through medical. Um, those things are important to talk about too, because in there are those clues about what they went through. The For the malnutrition, the fact that a lot of Irish descended people today still have, issues with their teeth, with their guts, just the exposure to sun, the exposure to salt.
yeah, the exposure to the sun, I always think that was God's big practical joke on the Irish. Let's make the fairest people you can, and let's put them mostly in as industrious farmers where they're spending their day out in the sun. Let's do that.
Mm.
But I mean, I think of my grandfather, my father, my great grandfather, apparently, and my uncles all have skin cancer, and not that they spent a lot of time in the sun. It's just they're it's genetically predisposed to it, and it's just and and it can come from being, in Ireland where, I joke about them being out in the sun, but it's basically a gloomy, uh, you know, they have
Mhm.
they have sun. It's the same as the Scottish. You know, um, yeah, we have summer in Ireland. Last year it was on a Wednesday,
Right. Yeah.
right?
And
So they you know they had adapted to that that thing where they weren't exposed to the sun, so they didn't have to. They hadn't a need for building up the tolerance as much, but come to North America where their sun's different. They now have this new thing that they're dealing with that wasn't
Mhm.
there before.
Right. One last point I wanna make, before I forget. You mentioned, like the highland clearances, and industrial farm work. And I think too, we need to, let me rephrase that, sorry. I feel like it's really important for us to discuss the layers in which these, we call settlers, or emigrated in, whatever term we are using. I think it's important that we distinguish the layers in time in which they were, coming over. Because if we think, about the the Great Famine. For example, like these people, it was life or death. They were coming here because they had no other choice. And then you've got people who were like in the 1600s, for example, coming into Newfoundland. Like there was the French versus the British coming in, and then you get stories. Uh, this is where the oppressor versus the oppressed comes in, and we lose the layers and oversimplifying it. Um, and we end up erasing the very real things that happened to our ancestors, and that I think is so important to distinguish, so that we are contextualizing it as um everyone's history versus you know them versus us. It creates this division that is very prominent in today's society, I feel.
And I mean, as part of the division, honestly, that's been around, that a lot of times caused our ancestors to come over here because there was some division in their own culture. You think we would have learned from that those lessons would have been passed on, and yeah, understanding your own history does make you appreciate that and understand that. Well, I look at somebody like the Irving, and I know a lot of people are down on the Irvings. They think that they're these um, multimillionaires that control a lot of things. But Casey Irving, his grandfather came here because of the clearances, not a penny to his name. Within 2 generations, his grandson was consistently one of the richest men in the world. And I mean, um, there's got to be something if when you look back at the character of the grandfather to come over here and rebuild and instill things in his if he in his descendants that caused him to be industrious, um, caused him to take advantage of the chances that they didn't have in Scotland. Something, even if it was just the grandfather telling the stories about being poor and being here, that drove them to succeed. There's things like that in everybody's story that you don't understand. My third great grandfather, I talked to you before we started about his building. He owned a soda factory. He came here as an indentured servant, so he was basically a slave that was signed on to a certain time. He bought out his indenture, meant he wound up being alderman in Halifax. He owned a large company in Halifax manufacturing soda. His son was the first RCMP officer to be killed in action in Canada in the Northwest Mounted Police. It's a story that that happened to somebody from an immigrant today. We'd be wanting to write a movie about it. You'd be flocking to the theaters to hear this story. But when you start looking back, you realize that was a very common sort of story in a way of a lot of our immigrants, because they didn't go through that struggle to get here, from being oppressed to having a chance, some opportunities they might not have had, or it depends who they were when they came, whether they were the oppressor or the oppressed, like you said, who really was. Um, it's if you were talking, if you're French, you're probably going to talk about the English that were oppressors. If you're English, you're going to say, well, the French weren't so great either. This is what they did, and there's truth in that. Um, Unfortunately, people just usually take one side or the other, and instead of looking at the whole picture and looking at it from an individual perspective and saying, well, what does that teach me about me? What lessons do I have from my ancestors that I can take with me into the 21st century? Because there's so much there.
And you're so right. I think it's really important that we distinguish those differences, because for example, when looking into my ancestry, it's I had a very similar story or experience. You know you hear the last name Butler, and there are so many things that come up when you type it in, and one of the very first things I get told is, oh, they come from Ireland. And then the next thing I get told is, oh, well, everybody comes from there. And so that was the driving force for me. I was like, it's either like, no matter what, I have to, and it, like I said, I was up and down with my emotions in this um discovery, because just when I thought I found something, then I'd be like, oh no. And then when I started to, learn more about some of the things that we were discussing earlier, it gave more context. And it kind of then allowed me to take it takes the ego inflation out of it, and allows you to see it clearly. And I would see stories going back to the Johns and the Williams and the Marys, okay? The unreal amount of William Butlers, the unreal amount of Mary Butlers. It took me almost 2 years to find the documents that would then finally sort out who was who. And even then, once I had that all situated and verified, it was then to learn succession law. Then it was learning, all of these other things that, it took a very long time to be able to understand who was who, because the stories I got told, about my family being colonizers. Like that one dug so deep for me that I I cannot tell you how long I spent feeling that. And I don't think I anticipated the emotional weight that I was going to have to bear and unbear throughout this entire process. And you bring up a good point about the oppressor versus the oppressed. And I wasn't satisfied enough with the answer that my ancestors were the oppressor. I just couldn't live with that enough. And I got a lot of feedback from that, because, that then turned into, well, you're looking for something in, I use these quotations, white history that's not there. And I said, well, no, I'm not trying to take away from anybody by finding this information. That was so important to distinguish. I'm not taking away from other people's suffering to distinguish my family's suffering as well. I'm not trying to eradicate or erase any wrongdoings. I'm trying to discern whether it was that person that did it or this person that did it. And that's such a hard one to go down. And it comes down to, we're never going to know the full truth. You weren't there. You didn't see it with your own eyes. All we can do is speculate. And um, it brought me to a much broader understanding of who am I, and what legacy am I going to leave behind, so that I can ensure that my ancestors are proud, that my descendants are proud. And maybe along the way, I can educate people and maybe change their perspective. I'm not out here to try and take away from anybody else's story, but I do think that with some of the research that I've done, it can lead to less deception, less division, more acceptance, and better understanding of who we are, where we came from, why it's so important that we distinguish these things. And um, I think it can bring people closer in all cultural and ethnicity backgrounds.
You're so right. I mean, um, we also don't understand the motivations or their life experiences. I often say, to me, history should be something that we learn to develop our values from. We learn things that were right and wrong, and we develop. But it seems like it's the opposite now. People want to take our values and they want to make history reflect our values today, as opposed to, well, let's examine what the values were and let history influence our values. They want the other way around. That our values have to reflect history. Well, that's what it's such a if you don't really try to understand the values, the experiences that people were going through, to understand, um, you know, what was going on, and understanding the greater history around that time, and not looking at from the oppressed and the oppressor, but the survivor and the survivor, because a lot of times, when we think about the the big thing in Canada now, the indigenous population. When you're thinking about that, there's often the oppressor to the and the colonizer, but they don't realize that there were certain native tribes that were allied with the English or British, and certain were allied with the French, and before that, before the Europeans came, they were battling each other often. Understanding that whole history is unfortunately one. They say victors get the right to history. There are victors, and yes, often they write the history, but it doesn't necessarily mean the history they've written is completely wrong. The history is from their perspective. I'm sure if Germany had won World War II, there would be a whole different perspective on history that people would have. That we would be appalled that now the living that we are. But if anybody tried to say any differently, and you would grow up with that new version of history, you would be thinking, that it's correct. I'm not espouting that it was correct. I'm just saying it does reflect what you do, and you have to understand that the average German soldier wasn't a Nazi. They were doing what they were told to. They were influenced by somebody who was a great manipulator. People understanding that instead of saying, well, everybody from there was evil. Everybody who was a colonist was a colonizer. What we use the term to mean. Yes, that's if they were people that they were often fleeing their own home, whether out of force or economics, and they were trying to make the best for themselves. And they were doing what they had to survive and to thrive, and don't necessarily punish them because they wound up thriving. If there's something that they legitimately should be punished for, you don't overlook that either. Like I tell people, you have to be aware of what you find in history when you start reading answers, because you might find things you don't like. But it's the difference. If I was to tell you your second great grandfather was a pirate, people would think, oh, that's cool. But if I was to say your second great grandfather was a murderer, rapist, and robber, what would you think? Oh,
It would you take it very critically, and so I think you make a very good point there. The vocabulary is important, because it's not, the problem isn't that it's hidden history, or that it's incomplete education, it's incomplete vocabulary, or lack of vocabulary and understanding. I feel historical literacy sometimes demonizes, or both one way or the other, and uh we will never really truly know. Perspective is speculative, and there's also the factors of institutionally streamlining things for different countries. Like the biggest thing that I realized was that what is taught in, say, for example, United States versus Canada, what is,
I mean,
and not that we're being told,
oh,
well, right, and I'm not that we're being told different information, but terminology is different, so that it ends up creating this separation in our minds, and then until you're told, well, that story is this story, you can't. Do you know what I'm trying to say
I
here?
know
Like,
exactly what you
I
mean.
it's really important that we understand history's timeline as a whole, and not just what we're taught up until grade 12. Like, you don't have to stop learning. You can and it doesn't to say you have to go into it as deep as me or you have, but just the basics of understanding the contextuality, that history and humans are two separate things, and we oftentimes put those two things into one story. We don't look at the of the psychology of what was happening in that time. Survival, like you said, is a huge factor in a lot of people's decisions, especially when it came to like things like the Highland clearances too. um and I think that, having these conversations, like having me on your podcast, and just getting into these Facebook groups and talking to individuals, and having an open mind, and being accepting of others' stories without taking it so critically, or um, you know, taking it as a part of our own identity, allows us to have open conversations and possibly change some of these narratives going forward. For the I have 3 children. I don't want this next generation to continue this, two sides versus each other narrative. Life is not that simple, and
No.
it just isn't.
Yeah. There's black and white, but there is a lot of gray when it comes to people.
The dash in between.
Yeah, it's like, your perspective of what is right and what is wrong sometimes is very influenced by the what you're living in, what you're going through. It's you know the the sort of idea people would think, well, I would forgive somebody if they were stealing a loaf of bread for their family, as opposed to they were just stealing, which both are equally wrong,
Hmm.
no matter what the reason. But by understanding that reason and having compassion on that person, that, oh, they're doing this to survive, gives you a whole different perspective on that
Hmm.
they're just not it. And like I said, it's the same as with the pirate. I could call them a murderer, rapist, eh, and that's one way to explain them. But if you call them a pirate, it's much different. It's kind of cool, that they're evil, uh,
Hmm.
but it comes with a story to it. And that's what people forget. We all have people like that in our background, good and bad. We have
Yes.
people that fought fought the injustices at the time, and sometimes that injustice is just the trying to leave that history for the next generation, so that they realize the injustice is that somebody decided there was a right and a wrong, and let's get back to it. So I thank you very
Mhm.
much. I really enjoyed this.
Oh, no
As I had a
problem.
much different conversation than I thought I was going to have going into this, which is awesome. I really enjoyed your perspective. I'd love to have you on again and talk to you about this
Thank you.
other things. I'm just understanding history is such a big important of genealogy, and likewise, genealogy helps you understand and put the history in perspective as well when you start making that connections. So
Hmm.
I'm really glad to have you on here, and thank you. And is there I know you have done some books of photography, I believe.
Not
On your
quite.
website?
So actually, I do currently have 3 books available on Amazon. They are self-published.
Okay.
One of them is a poem structured book in discovering oneself. So it's got some uh, lines in there, some coloring pages, and also some of my own poetry. And the other 2 are sort of informational. One is for preteens, and one is for those with the neurodivergencies, to help us, structure our lives a little bit better. I am currently documenting the line securely, my family line securely into the 1600s, and carefully verifying the earlier connections. My goal here with that is not, myths or titles. It's clarity and structure, and that will be contextualized into a formal text very shortly. And that one will be, well, there'll be a little more talk on that one later on.